Wake, he only ever refers to us as 621, our artificial augmentation serial number. With this name, 621, he's still treating us as something a bit less than human, but at least he's not treating us like an animal anymore. Instead, he treats us like a machine. This contrasts with Air later on, who calls us Raven, which is something much closer to a humanizing name, and part of why 621 ultimately develops a closer relationship with Air than other characters, because she treats 621 like an actual person. She cares about 621's feelings. But let's get back to Walter. Walter himself kind of acts like a machine in his dialogue. He doesn't really behave like a human being with feelings. Just listen to his dialogue. It is so stripped down, so stripped of anything emotional or sensitive. His words are efficient, to the point, soldier-like. Walter is a man on a mission, and for much of the game he cares about nothing but completing that mission. But we won't learn what that mission is until much later in the game. At the start of the game, he has a cover story, a false reason for operating on planet Rubicon, which we will hear about in this next cutscene.
If we get our hands on Rubicon's coral, we'll make a killing. Plenty for a merc with a fried brain like you to buy their life back. Enough chat, back to work.
We answer the call.
Scavenge the AC Rex ahead. Find a valid mercenary license. We're illegals here. You'll need ID to operate.
Walter says that if they can find Coral together on Rubicon, he and 621 will make oodles and oodles of cash. And he gives 621 a motivation to be here too, enough money to buy your life back. Walter says that 621 has a fried brain. I think he's referring to the side effects of early generation augmentation. It's made clear in other parts of the game that very few subjects survived those early rounds of augmentation. The surgeries and implants and Coral destroyed their minds and bodies. 621 is a survivor of 4th generation augmentation. That augmentation has allowed them to expertly pilot an armored core, but it has damaged their brain, left them incapable of speech. With enough money, 621 could undergo later generation augmentation, which could reverse some of those side effects. Another AC pilot in the game, V3 O'Keefe of the Vespers, has done exactly that. His arena bio states that he only agreed to work with Arquebus if they provided him with Generation 9 augmentation to counteract the coral burn-in on his brain. I suspect that 621 has similar coral burn-in. Handler Walter is pretty openly manipulating 621 here. We see in the story trailer that 621 appears to be barely functioning, barely still surviving their augmentation surgeries. 621 is desperate and Handler Walter offers them hope. At first, this was probably just a false hope. When they first met, I doubt if Walter had any intention of following through on this promise. I don't think it's until after he sees how hard 621 fights, how crucial 621 becomes to his mission, that he starts to grow more sympathetic to them. So this is Handler Walter's stated motivation. He's here to make money, lots and lots of money. And to do that, he's looking for Coral. This is the Handler Walter we are dealing with for the entire first chapter of the game. He's someone who doesn't care about anything but the mission, and that mission is making money. He is cold, acts like even more of a machine than 621 at times. Together, we take on cynical corporate contracts to destroy and slaughter the planet's native resistance, the Rubicon Liberation Front. At the start, this is a sort of miserable story about two pretty miserable, desperate, and greedy characters. It's not until the very end of Chapter 1 that his character gets a little more interesting. Towards the end of Chapter 1, Walter receives a mysterious message from an, at that point, unknown party. Let's listen to it together.
Long time no see, Walter. Looking good for a change. I see you've got a new augmented human. What happened to 617 and the rest?
Their jobs. They did what it took to get us here.
Your presence is strong.
Huh.
Any last words?
So how's the newcomer doing?
Anima are restless.
Adequately.
Enemy research complete.
But Gen 4 augmentation can be unstable.
We are
We need to
listening.
choose our battles. How's things on your end?
Ready.
I found the data our friends left behind. There's something promising in the watch point.
So Walter is speaking with Cinder Carla, who we meet in-game later on. She's the mysterious leader of the RAD, a group of dosers and black market weapon manufacturers, which we will eventually learn she is using as a front for a hidden faction on Rubicon, the Overseers, of which both she and Walter are members. This dialogue between the two is the first time in the game when it becomes apparent that Walter's motivations and character are not as simple as he is presenting. He has some other motivation to be here, some other scheme he's not being honest about. We also learned that he was previously working with another group of AC pilots who, like 621, are only ever referred to by their serial numbers. Just like our player character, they were stripped of their humanity by augmentation surgeries. And notice how callously Walter speaks of his previous partners. They did their jobs. That's all he has to say about people who he once worked side by side with. People who sacrificed their lives to further his plans. But remember, Walter isn't actually this cold. We'll see later that he really does grow to care about 621, which means he probably cared about those former pilots too. Then why is he acting so coldly here? Well, Walter is written very similarly to another character I've covered extensively on this channel, Kratos from God of War. In the newer God of War games, Kratos is a character who keeps his emotions bottled up so that he can protect himself from those emotions, to protect himself from his own destructive anger, from the guilt he feels. I think Handler Walter does something very similar in Armored Core 6. He purposely represses his emotions, whatever guilt or sorrow he feels for those deaths, so that he can focus on his mission, so he can complete this task he feels must be accomplished. But who were 617 and the rest? We can actually see their deaths in the Armored Core 6 story trailer. Here we see 617, 619, and 620 getting killed during some combat operation run by Walter. Fans have speculated that they are punching a hole in the PCA's planetary defense system here. I'm unconvinced by that theory, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this essay. In an analysis of Handler Walter's character, all that matters is that all three of them died for him, and because they died, he had to resort to recruiting 621 as a desperate replacement. 621 actually appears in that trailer too. You can see his warped and emaciated body lying on an operating table. Here, visually, we can see how drastic and destructive 621's augmentation was. A voice in the trailer states that 621 is barely operational, that Walter should not expect him to do anything other than function at a very basic level. Recruiting 621 was a really desperate move by Walter. He only did it because he had no other choice, because all of his other pilots were dead. But let's get back to that conversation between Walter and Carla. Carla tells Walter that there is something promising in the Watchpoint, and then Walter assigns 621 the mission of attacking that Watchpoint, which is a huge risk considering it's being defended by the Subject Guard, government forces who even the corporations are not willing to engage with. There we meet Sula, an independent mercenary who clearly knows Walter, knows about the cold and callous way Walter treats his mercenaries, the way he sacrifices their lives. Sula personally knew those 3 dead pilots from the trailer. Sula's dialogue is meant to make us, the audience, question Walter's motivations, question his treatment of 621, question whether we can trust this guy at all. There's something promising in the Watchpoint turns out to be some leftover coral, and specifically, this coral contains the coral consciousness entity known as Air, who makes contact with 621 here. Air and Walter are sort of foils to each other. Where Walter is cold and unsympathetic and manipulative, Air is emotional. She expresses her feelings. She's open about her intentions and her motivations. She expresses concern for 621's well-being in a way that Walter never does. The writers want you to warm up to Air. Her warmth contrasts his coldness. The writers are intending for you to choose her over him. Except that Walter does contain warmth. He does express his feelings in small ways. He becomes a more complex character as the story progresses, and that complicates the player's choice too. Chapter 2 is all about Air, but Walter has a lot more to say and do in chapters 3 and 4. However, what's most interesting to me about his character here is the way he gives up control. At the start of the game, Walter is presented as being controlling and manipulative. He's here on Rubicon to accomplish a very specific specific personal mission, and he's just using 621 as a tool, a means to an end. However, in chapters 3 and 4, Walter really does give up that control. He lets 621 choose their own missions, even if those choices ultimately contradict his own plans. He begins to recognize 621 as a person, as an equal partner, someone with feelings and needs, not just a tool, not just a mutt. The player will experience this in gameplay. As the game progresses, you, the player, are allowed more and more control over choosing your own missions. And in these chapters, Walter begins to very obviously care about 621, care about their well-being, care about how they are being treated by others. To see this development in Walter's character, we are going to listen to 3 different clips of his dialogue. Here's the first one.
How's it going, Walter?
Your
Hard to
presence
say.
is strong. Harmony
621 still
Research
performing well, but
forgiveness.
I doubt the voices have
Is
gone
it
away.
time?
At any rate, whatever the voices are doesn't seem to be doing any harm. For now.
I was asking about you, Walter. But whatever. Bigger things. The coral. You'd better find it. Turns out, our friend's fears were warranted.
Restless.
Don't spend too long dealing with the PCA, Walter.
Colonizable planets
Clock's
have been
ticking.
discovered. We answer the call.
In this conversation, Carla asks Walter how he's doing, as his comrade in the Overseers, as his friend. And instead of saying anything about himself, how he personally is holding up, how he personally is feeling, Walter only speaks about 621. He talks about 621's well-being, his concern over whether 621 is being harmed by those voices they're hearing. Here, Walter is revealing his true priorities, what he really cares about, and I doubt that even he realizes he's doing it. He doesn't actually care about the mission as much as he cares about 621. We know this because he doesn't talk about how the mission is progressing in this dialogue. He only talks about 621. Now, to see more evidence of this care, let's listen to 2 more clips.
You again. I'm a busy man, far too busy for the likes of you.
So I hear.
All power
Must be
to
a
jump
tough time
drive.
to be the Vespers
Is it
deputy
time?
commander.
Civilian structure
Get to the
complete.
point.
For the unity.
The plan to raid the PCA. You're going to need more pawns on the board.
Of course, you're here to hawk your services again.
A colonizable
Very
planet
well.
has been
I'll consider that
discovered.
mutt of yours part of the effort.
Our
One more
vengeance
thing.
is yours.
Show my hound some respect. Gen 4's as good a pedigree as any other.
We got ourselves a deal,
Our will shall be done.
Michigan.
Is it time?
So,
As you wish.
Archibus met us halfway.
Hostility research tier
I gave them the
complete.
heavy warship fleet.
Logistics
In
upgrade
exchange,
complete.
Balaam's in charge of putting down the beast. They also offered some top Vespers. Guess they don't trust us.
Better than nothing. I'll provide what support I can too.
Yeah, your mad scientists, RED or whatever, and that hound of yours.
Michigan. Don't underestimate 621. That hound
structure
always
complete.
delivers.
Our vengeance is
In
yours.
each of these clips, Walter is leaping to 621's defense. He is asking the commanders of the Red Guns and the Vespers to treat 621 with the respect they deserve, the respect they have earned. There is no reason for Walter to do this. Whether or not 621 is treated with respect makes no difference to Walter's mission. Everyone in the game can treat 621 like a dog, and Walter can still accomplish his mission. And yet, Walter still goes out of his way to defend 621, out of his way to make sure 621 is being treated right by those other commanders. There is something parental in Walter's dialogue here, a fatherly quality, or maybe a big brother. He's looking out for his son or little bro, making sure the other kids are treating him right. There's something really touching about this dialogue. Walter is trying to make things better for 621 in the small ways that he can, and it shows a development in their relationship. At the start, Walter treated 621 as a tool, something less than human to be used. But 621 has worked their butt off, has accomplished some really incredible things. And in doing so, I think 621 has actually earned Walter's respect. This is is all further evidence that Walter is a character who cares. Now, let's move on to the reveal of Walter's true intentions and his past. At the bottom of Watchpoint Alpha, you discover the ruins of Institute City and the vascular plant, where all the surviving coral on the planet has been slowly converging. And afterwards, Walter finally explains why he's been searching for that coral. So let's listen to that now.
Let me tell you a story before you go. There once was a scientist. He abandoned his family to delve into the secrets of coral. His work yielded a carnival of horrors, augmentation surgery included. But there was another scientist. He took his colleagues' sins upon himself and set it all ablaze. Died with no regrets. There's a lesson in this story. Once something's alive, it doesn't die easy. 621. Story time's over. It's time for work.
Civilian structure complete.
It's important to note that Walter is still putting some distance between himself and his true feelings, between his past and his present. Instead of just saying, this is who I am and this is what I want, he has to obliquely reveal those things through this story, in a more distant third-person narration. This is another way that Walter protects himself from his own emotions. By putting his feelings into this story, telling it as if it has nothing to do with him, it protects him from having to deal with those feelings and those events directly. The scientist who abandoned his family was Walter's own father, a man whose research created what Walter refers to as a carnival of horrors. It seems to me that Walter feels some personal responsibility for the sins of his father. He has dedicated his life to making those wrongs right, even though he's not the one who actually committed those sins. The other scientist in the story is Professor Nagai, the director of the Rubicon Research Institute, who ignited the fires of Ibis, destroying himself and the institute he had led, and the planet's surface, and even the entire surrounding star system. All this destruction and attempt to prevent a coral convergence. Walter clearly admires Professor Nagai, believes that his sacrifice was honorable. Walter plans to emulate his hero, to recreate that sacrifice, to light a second fire, to destroy coral so that it can never again be misused in those hideous ways that his father misused it, so those sins can never be repeated. If Walter succeeds in lighting a second fire, he knows that he will die, but not just him. Probably everyone else on the planet will be killed too. The Rubiconians, the corporations, the mercenaries, 621, Carla, the PCA, all of them. And not just them either. The fire will spread throughout space. There is no way to predict how far it will spread, how many inhabited planets it might burn. In some ways, this motivation makes Walter into a kind of monster. No wonder he has to put on this cold and callous mask to suppress his own feelings when he plans to commit such a horrific and destructive act. But from another perspective, Walter is a kind of hero. It becomes clear in the other endings that coral simply cannot be controlled or contained. It replicates too fast. It contains too much energy. As long as it exists, coral convergence and coral release are inevitable. These will be destructive events. They will transform the entire galaxy. They will transform the human race, actually destroy the human race, and give birth to something new in our place. The only way to prevent this is to burn all of the coral. Walter and the other overseers have made the perhaps heroic choice to sacrifice themselves and everyone else on the planet to save the rest of humanity, to right the wrongs of the past. Of course, from yet another perspective, he's really just recommitting an old sin, continuing to hold humanity back from its inevitable and necessary evolution, killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions in the process. Walter's motivations are morally ambiguous. The writers leave it up to the player to decide what is right or wrong here. The writers at From Software never write stories with obvious good guys and bad guys, never tell tales of heavy-handed morality. They always write morally gray stories where most characters are truly just trying to do their best in an impossible situation. As a side note, the only reason Walter himself survived survived the fires of Ibis is because he was sent away to Jupiter, while the planet he had called home, everyone he had ever known, his entire life was burned away. He could only watch from a distance. This time, he won't just watch though. This time, he plans to light those fires himself. In the first two playthroughs, Walter will be captured by Arquebus, then sent to a re-education camp where he is tortured, probably forcefully augmented, and definitely literally brainwashed into becoming a slave for Arquebus. However, before becoming a slave, he somehow manages to rescue 621, to put our comatose body in an old AC, and send us to relative safety in the ruined sewers of Institute City. When 621 wakes up, we hear a message Walter left for us, which we're going to listen to now.
621, a friend of mine sent a request.
We cannot survive without armor.
No, this one comes from me. You know what hidden dangers lurk within the coral. The fires of Ibis should have wiped the coral out, but it survived, gathered, and it's been steadily multiplying ever since. Now the coral convergence is growing at an exponential rate. Eventually, it'll spill out from Rubicon and contaminate space itself. The coral must be burned, 621. Even if that means reigniting the fire that scorched the stars. This isn't an order. It's a legacy. My fallen friends entrusted this duty to me, and now it's my turn to hand it on. 621.
Commerce upgrade
Feed the
complete.
fire.
Our vengeance is
Let the
yours.
last cinders
Cry
burn.
for mercy. Your presence is strong.
I have one
Victory
last
is
job
at
for
hand.
you. Find your freedom.
Glory to the unity.
Walter starts off this message by propping up a familiar artifice. He has another request from a friend. Then he catches himself and changes his mind. No, this is a request from me. This is a really important moment for his character. The moment when he finally drops all the artifice, drops all the masks, closes the emotional distance, and chooses to be honest. For the first time in the entire game, he is being totally open about his motivations and feelings. All this time, Walter wasn't really doing any of this for himself. He's been doing it for his fallen comrades. With their deaths, they left him a duty, and he feels honor-bound to carry it out, no matter the cost. If he fails in this task, he won't be failing himself. He feels that he will fail all those fallen comrades, render their sacrifices meaningless. That's why he's fighting so hard. That's why he cannot give up. But in the end, he cannot light those fires himself. He has been captured and muzzled by Arquebus. So in a final desperate act, he does the only thing he can do. He asks 621 to complete his mission for him, knowing that 621 might choose a different path, knowing that 621 might fail. Notably, his final job isn't actually to burn the coral. Instead, it's the much more cryptic phrase, "Find your freedom." Let's fast forward to the endings now, both of which involve Walter. You can choose to fulfill Walter, your savior and benefactor's final wish. You can choose to burn the coral. If you do so, afterwards you'll hear one final message from Walter, in which he thanks 621, expresses a hope that someday 621 might fulfill their true potential. In typical handler Walter fashion, this message is curt, quick, and to the point, but it does contain genuine affection and gratitude, is a meaningful conclusion to his character's story arc. In the other ending, if we choose to free the coral, Arquebus will send a brainwashed and augmented Walter to stop us. He serves as the final boss in the game. In his dialogue, at first he says he's fighting for the corporation, but then changes his mind, and says that he is fighting for his fallen friends instead. He also says that he can see and hear air for the first time, a result of his new coral-based augmentation. He begs 621 to make a different choice, to burn the coral. He says that we can take all the money we earned from those corporate missions, use it to afford surgery to undo the coral burn-in on our brains, to buy a new life for ourselves, to do exactly what he had promised at the start of the game. His dialogue in this final battle is genuinely kind of heartbreaking. He clearly doesn't want to fight this fight, but whether it's the corporate brainwashing or the wishes of his dead friends, he feels that he has to fight. When you actually defeat him, something really fascinating occurs, which we're going to watch together now.
As you wish. Your presence is strong. We'll consider it.
The mission.
What's on your mind?
Another planet joins the Unity. Hostility research
My
complete.
friends' wishes. Look at you, 621.
Exotics have been unveiled by our scholars.
What lies
You
before
found
us? We understand.
friend.
Commerce upgrade complete.
Your presence is strong. Our will shall be done. We shall overcome. And we have to go faster. For the Unity. Desecrators assault our world.
It's really important to note that Walter has broken through the archivist brainwashing here. His strength of will is so great that not even the terrible scientists at Arquebus with all their power can keep him muzzled. When he makes this choice, he is making it as Walter, not as Arquebus's puppet. He is choosing to stop fighting. He's choosing to lower his weapon, to let 621 live with his newfound friend, to give up on his old destructive mission. For me, this is the moment when Walter becomes a true hero. Walter has spent all his life fighting for his fallen comrades. But 621 has become a comrade too, a partner, even a friend. And more importantly, 621 is still alive. Is Walter really going to kill 621 just to honor the wishes of all those long dead people? And it turns out that the answer is no. In the end, Walter proves that he cares more about 621 than he cares about his mission. He cares more about the living than the dead. In the end, Walter's cold and callous and unfeeling mask is proven to be just that, a mask, an artifice, never his true self. In truth, Walter was always a character who cared. I was really surprised and impressed by the writing in Armored Core 6. I think this is some of the best narrative work From Software has ever done, because the characters in this story have so much more character than a lot of their other games. These characters are written to be complex, to have ambiguous motivations, to have big personalities, to go through full character arcs, to be really memorable. And at the top of that pile of memorable characters is Handler Walter, this gruff and controlling mercenary handler, fighting for the dead, fighting to burn down the world, who, in his last moments, cannot bring himself to raise his weapon against a friend, even if it means abandoning the mission that dominated his entire life. I think Walter is easily one of the best characters From Software has ever written.
Civilian structure complete.
We dare not stray from our path.
The Unity has fallen silent on one of our planets. Hostility research complete.
If that is our will.
Commerce upgrade complete.
That path is perilous. If that is our will. Shields down! We're exposed to attack!
Harmony research complete. Civilian structure
The planet
complete.
Rubicon, a world of barren wastelands, abandoned cities, and ruined megalithic technology, is host to a web of competing factions: intergalactic megacorp vultures, freedom fighters, government muscle, secret societies, alien life forms, artificial intelligence, scavengers, vagrants, wanderers, and mercenaries, each of them vying for control of the all-important and mysterious resource known as coral, a strange substance native to the planet Rubicon, capable of incredible feats of energy, data transfer, and biological transformation. But before we talk about each of those factions, we need to talk more about coral. Coral is a substance with tremendous potential for weaponry, for technology, for evolution, and for destruction. Coral is a living substance. Coral has the appearance of a sort of fog or mist, little red shining particles floating freely in space. You can see electrical sparks shooting between the particles, and this is intentionally designed to resemble the way electrical sparks shoot between the nerve cells in our brains. In the exact same way that consciousness, this mysterious sense of self, our individual and unique perception of the universe somehow emerges from the interactions between nerve cells in our brains, a consciousness also emerges from the interactions between coral particles. Coral is alive. It is made up of many hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of voices or personalities floating among the coral particles. Some of these are personalities that have been absorbed by the coral, human psyches that have been somehow pulled out of their bodies and into the coral flow. I think this is what you're seeing in the final ending of the game, when the coral surges and all these mechs wake up. That's human AC pilots who are lost in the coral suddenly coming free again. But we'll talk about that ending in a lot more detail in another video. I also believe that some of those personalities in the coral are actually original to the coral itself. New life forms, new personalities born of the coral, native to the coral, and thus native to the planet Rubicon. I think Air, our coral companion in the game, is one such original coral life form. That's why she calls herself a Rubiconian. She is a life form native to this planet. Coral itself is one of the factions that make up the web of conflicts on the war-torn wasteland planet of Rubicon, and the first one we will discuss in this video. Coral is my favorite kind of alien life in fiction, the truly weird, life utterly unlike our own. So often in science fiction, alien life is depicted as bipedal creatures, basically human except wearing funny hats. Coral is something much stranger than that. Coral life is made up of naturally occurring energy particles and electrical sparks, from which a consciousness is spontaneously born. It is not biological life. It doesn't seem to leave any noticeable mark on its environment. It doesn't build cities, it doesn't invent technology, it can't even speak in the traditional sense of the word. The only reason our player character, Raven, can communicate with Coral at all is because Raven is an augmented human. A human who has been artificially augmented using coral. Presumably, Air communicates with Raven through the coral present in his body, by interacting with those particles. The exact nature of this augmentation isn't entirely clear. The game doesn't provide very many details. We know that coral has some sort of ability to manipulate and transform the human body. I think the electrical currents of coral particles probably interact with or change the functions of those electrical currents within our own nervous system in some way. The purpose of this augmentation appears to be enhanced nervous functioning, faster reflexes, greater mental acuity, things like that. We know that this is a dangerous procedure, that most humans do not survive this forced artificial evolution, but we also know that harmony between the human nervous system and coral consciousness is possible. Raven is an example of this. Raven survived this merger with coral, and accomplishes far more working alongside coral than they ever could have alone. Many of the factions on Rubicon are seeking coral just for its energy capabilities, which are said to be nearly limitless. But its true value lies in its potential for evolution. A harmony between the human nervous system and the nervous system of coral could mean a transformation for both life forms. The only member of this coral faction we ever interact with is Air. For most of the game, Air exists in voice only. She is literally a voice in Raven's head. Air is something of a technological wizard, hacking security systems, analyzing enemy mechs, and even seizing control of planetary satellites. Through her, it's demonstrated that coral, most likely through its electrical properties, is able to manipulate and control technology in some pretty crazy ways. It also demonstrates how intelligent coral is. Coral is an intelligent life form that is very easily able to manipulate human machinery. But what does coral actually want? What are their goals? Well, I think that coral wants basically three different things. First and foremost, coral wants to survive. Coral just wants to live its life, man. It doesn't want to be destroyed in the technological experiments of the Institute or the corporations, and it doesn't want to be annihilated by the second fires of Ibis the Overseers plan to ignite. We can see coral defend itself multiple times in the game. The Ibis series CEL-240 mech, which you encounter outside the vascular plant, is directly controlled by coral in an attempt to defend itself. Air takes control of the IBIS series SOL-644 in one of the endings for the same reason. Secondly, Coral wants to be with other Coral. It's stated multiple times in the game that Coral has a natural tendency to gather with other Coral to form huge masses of the substance. Air refers to other Coral as her brothers and sisters, meaning that all Coral life forms consider themselves to be part of one big interconnected family, and they prefer to be together rather than alone. Just like humanity, most humans prefer to be around other humans too. This isn't unique to Coral. The third and final goal of Coral is to merge with humanity, to evolve with humanity, into some kind of joint transcendent life form. Or at least that's what Air wants. It's hard to say what the rest of the Coral thinks. We see this in her ending, and I actually want to watch that ending in its full, because it does a great job explaining her personal motivations. So here it is.
Dare not stray from our path.
We have cleansed the planet of humans.
Raven,
We maintain our vigil.
one day, humanity and Coral will thrive together. You kept our potential safe.
Our confidence wavers.
Hostility research
I know
complete.
Walter feared a collapse. But I promise you,
Through our shield.
there's another way.
We must be vigilant. Moving into phase space.
Raven,
Harmony research complete.
we'll find it together.
This ending cutscene is one of those classic From Software open-ended and understated conclusions where things still remain very uncertain. Consequences are never explicitly stated but only implied. Air is certain that humanity and Coral can live together without destroying each other, that the horrific disasters of the early generations of augmented humans and a Coral collapse can both be avoided. And she might be right. At this moment, Raven and Air may have set humanity on a path towards transcendence and evolution. Of course, she could also be totally wrong. For all we know, in that ending, when we allow Coral to escape the planet, we may be dooming much of the galaxy to be destroyed in something called a Coral collapse, but we'll talk about that more later. However, Raven and Air's symbiotic relationship is evidence of the potential for cooperation and harmony between humanity and Coral. In any case, Coral is one of the many factions battling for control among the ruins of the planet Rubicon. As far as I can tell, there are 9 more factions in the game, and in this video I'm going to examine each and every one of them, and through their stories explain the overarching story of Armored Core 6. Those 9 factions are the Rubicon Research Institute, the Planetary Closure Administration, the Overseers, the Dosers, the Rubicon Liberation Front, Balaam Industries, Arquebus Corporation, the Independent Mercenaries, and Allmind. So let's start with the Rubicon Research Institute. Okay, so the Rubicon Research Institute is not an active faction in the present day. They were destroyed 50 years ago in the apocalyptic fires of Ibis. In fact, the Institute ignited those fires, destroying themselves along with most life not just on the planet, but in the entire local extended star cluster, a human-made disaster of unprecedented proportions. Because of their research into Coral and the incredibly advanced technology they developed, despite no longer being active, the Institute's influence still extends into every facet of the storyline, even long after their death. You cannot discuss the history of Rubicon without discussing the Rubicon Research Institute. They are central to everything. And let's talk a little bit about that history now. Rubicon 3 is the 3rd planet in the Rubicon star system, a remote system far from the centers of galactic power. An unknown number of years ago, this planet was colonized by humanity. Those first colonials discovered Coral, a substance with incredible energy potential. This discovery transformed the planet of Rubicon from an unknown backwater colony into a wealthy and advanced center of research, a place of titanic industry, where some of the most powerful weapons in the galaxy were developed and manufactured, a place of metropolis cities and megalithic architecture. This was a golden age for Rubicon. No one ever says anything about any kind of planetary government, so I suspect that the Rubicon Research Institute itself was the dominant political force on the planet. The Institute ran things here. The Institute built entire cities on the surface. And I mean, these are massive, huge cities. The population of this planet must have skyrocketed. It was during this period that the grid was constructed. An absolutely bonkers industrial megastructure that wraps all around the planet's surface. These are the structures you can see floating around in the sky in the background of most levels. Colossal in scale, the grid is nearly as big as the planet itself. Inside the grid, we can find a lot of industrial infrastructure. Furnaces, smelters, piping, fuel and coolant systems. It looks to me like the grid was some kind of planet-sized factory, intended for the construction of all the urban infrastructure we see across the planet, all the massive coral mining and surveying technology, weapons, spacefaring vessels, mechs, experimental technology, and who knows what else. It would have taken a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time, and a lot of manpower to construct the grid. This would have taken decades at minimum. Rubicon's golden age was not a short one, and the Institute's power was far-reaching. The center of the Institute's technocrat dominion was the Advanced Metropolis Institute City, the location of the vascular plant, where all coral on the planet was collected. It was here that the Institute's director, a man named Professor Nagai, ignited the fires of Ibis. Okay, so after most of the coral on the planet was collected here in the vascular plant, energy readings began to spike. The coral was mutating, evolving, becoming something new. This terrified Professor Nagai. He believed that these mutations were dangerous, posed some kind of terrible threat, would cause something called a coral collapse. Professor Nagai was willing to sacrifice everything to prevent this. His own life, the entire institute, everything they had created. He deployed Operation Ibis, a dramatic safeguard meant to protect the galaxy from the perceived threat of coral collapse. Coral contains an incredible amount of energy. What Operation Ibis did was use this energy to fuel an explosive chain reaction, similar to a nuclear bomb. Because coral contains so much energy, the explosion it caused was incredible in scale. Ibis ignited all the collected coral, lighting a horrific firestorm that not only burned the entire planet, but it spread throughout space and burned the entire local star system too. This was a fire bigger than a star, bigger than a supernova. The fires of Ibis must have killed millions of people at minimum. It destroyed the Institute, destroyed the planet's surface, the entire grid, burned every city on the planet. Institute City itself collapsed down into the interior of the planet. There, some of the coral survived, and in time, after the fires died out, a thick ice sheet would develop above the city, hiding it and its surviving coral until it was rediscovered by the PCA, but more on that later. The fires of Ibis marked the end of Rubicon's golden age, and the end of the Rubicon Research Institute, but not the end of the Institute's influence. Multiple factions in Armored Core 6 are still wielding salvaged Institute technology. Even all these decades later, those weapons not only still function, but they are some of the deadliest weapons you'll face in the game. All of the toughest bosses in Armored Core 6 are Institute creations. The Sea Spider, the Ice Worm, the Ibis mech that protects the vascular plant, the other Ibis mech that air controls in one ending, the other Ibis mech that Handler Walter pilots in another ending. Everywhere you look in Armored Core 6, from the barren wasteland of the planet's surface, to the ruined cities, to the incredible technology that still remains here, you're looking at the influence of the Institute. And every time you die, there's a good chance it was an Institute creation that killed you. The Rubicon Research Institute is another in a long line of research organizations that delve too deeply into dangerous knowledge in From Software's games. This is a theme that From Software revisits over and over again in their stories. The Duke's Archives in Dark Souls, Aldea's Keep in Dark Souls 2, the Grand Archives in Dark Souls 3, the Rhea Lucaria Academy in Elden Ring, but more than any other, the Rubicon Research Institute reminds me a lot of Byrgenwerth College in Bloodborne. The scholars of Byrgenwerth delved deep into the secrets of their world, discovered a substance of tremendous potential, called Old Blood, which had the power to lead humanity to its next stage of evolution, but also the power to destroy humanity too, held the potential for both evolution and extinction. The head of Byrgenwerth, a character called Provost Willem, desired to seal that power away to prevent its abuse, just like Professor Nagai tried to destroy Coral. The story of Byrgenwerth College perfectly mirrors the story of the Rubicon Research Institute. Byrgenwerth College was also destroyed, but its will lived on. Multiple successors claimed to carry the banner of Byrgenwerth into the future. And it's the same with the Institute. In Armored Core 6, the Institute's desire to safeguard the universe from the threat of a coral collapse is inherited by the Overseers, a secretive faction who manipulate events on Rubicon from behind the scenes. But before we examine the Overseers, I want to continue the chronological story of Planet Rubicon's history by discussing the Planetary Closure Administration. Okay, so after the fires of Ibis wiped out millions of lives and burned entire star systems, literally burned space-time itself, the galaxy realized that Coral and the planet Rubicon were both really dangerous, and so the Planetary Closure Administration was formed. Somewhere out in the universe of Armored Core 6, there is an extremely powerful, technologically advanced, and wealthy intergalactic government. We know absolutely nothing about this government, because the only branch we ever see or hear anything about is the Planetary Closure Administration. This is something interesting about the world building and writing of Armored Core 6. There is a lot of world building in this game, a lot of different factions, a lot of history, but the storytelling itself is what I would describe as very efficient, because of the terse manner in which the story is told, through short mission briefings, a little bit of dialogue during missions, and the very occasional cutscene. The audience can only ever be told the absolute essential details. It can be kind of frustrating not knowing as much about this world as we want to, but I do respect the craft. I respect the decision to cut a story down to its absolute essentials, to keep it as efficient as possible. But let's get back to examining the PCA, starting with that name. Planetary Closure Administration. It's meant to sound bureaucratic and awkward, the way a lot of real-world government agencies are named. It's meant to evoke images of committee meetings and boardrooms and government functionaries. But the PCA isn't just a bunch of chino pants wearing government bureaucrats. They are a powerful and advanced military force, the most powerful military force operating on planet Rubicon, far stronger than any of the other factions. I actually want to watch the scene where the PCA is introduced here, because it does an awesome job of demonstrating their power, so here it is.
Harmony research complete.
Looks like the coast is clear.
Our will shall
The
be
closure
done.
area is SG's jurisdiction. Why send an enforcement squad and a warship? Special mission, maybe? Or was it? Wait. Over there.
Trespassers to Rubicon, this is your warning. Disarm and withdraw from the closure area immediately. Resistance will be regarded as a declaration of war. And you will be marked for termination. The PCA makes no exceptions.
Presence is strong.
The PCA.
Planet item ready.
Looks like we got a little too eager, 621. Us and the corporations both.
Up to this point in the game, you've been bouncing between the Rubicon Liberation Front, Balaam, and Arquebus, the three strongest factions on the planet up to that point, who all seem basically equal in terms of military power. But then the PCA swoops in out of nowhere with an entire space fleet, a much larger army that is wielding far more advanced weaponry. The corporations and RLF are like bratty, bickering children, and then all of a sudden Dad gets home and he's freaking pissed. I love how abrupt and unexpected their intervention is. You're in the middle of a pretty typical scuffle between corporations, blasting some corporate private mechs, and then all of a sudden the PCA rockets in with this huge laser salvo that immediately destroys all of the other combatants. The game does a fantastic job at making the PCA immediately seem really powerful, but their appearance here is really neither abrupt nor unexpected. The PCA were here all along. Their defense satellites shot your entry craft out of the sky in the opening cutscene. Those same defense satellites tried to prevent you from crossing the ocean. Both the attack helicopter and Balteus were operated by the PCA. You faced their subordinates, the Subject Guard, in battle back during the attack on the Watch Point. The PCA are intervening here in a much bigger way because Raven and the corporations are getting too close to the location of the vascular plant, and therefore too close to the surviving coral that's being held there. I think it's important to note that the PCA's so-called suppression fleet flies in from somewhere else, from some other star system. Their headquarters are not on Rubicon. All this technology and weaponry is coming from somewhere else. But let's rewind back to the Fires of Ibis. After the Fires of Ibis burnt themselves out, the unnamed intergalactic government formed the PCA, an autonomous military and administrative branch equipped with a huge military fleet, a professional mech army, advanced technology, and a ton of resources. It's clear that the intergalactic government poured a lot of money into the creation and operation of the Planetary Closure Administration. Preventing a second Fires of Ibis situation is clearly really important to that government. The PCA declared the entire planet of Rubicon under quarantine. They sealed the planet off from the rest of the galaxy. To accomplish this, they set up that huge system of planetary defense satellites you see in the opening cutscene of the game. These defense satellites are supposed to prevent anyone from entering or exiting the planet, but they're clearly not all that effective. Not only does our player character survive atmospheric entry, but Balaam and Arquebus are both able to sneak entire invasion forces onto the planet. And afterwards, the PCA just sits by and allows the corporations and the Liberation Front to wage a full-scale war on the surface, along with extensive surveys in search of coral. For all its power, the PCA appears to be fairly incompetent. If they'd rocketed in with that suppression fleet immediately, instead of sitting around and allowing the corporations to build up their own power, they probably could have prevented all this from happening. Anyway, the PCA also manages the Watch Points, which were originally intended to monitor the now barren coral veins deep in the planet's surface, but which are now actually used by the PCA to contain the few remnants of coral that survived the Fires of Ibis. That's why there is a coral surge when Raven destroys the core of this watch point. It was being used to contain that surviving coral, and inside the particles of that coral is where our friend Air was being contained, separate from the rest of the coral on the planet, which is why Raven is able to make contact with her directly after the Watchpoint's destruction, and why she doesn't know where the rest of the coral is hiding. She's been cut off from them for a long time. But let's get back to the PCA. Along with the Subject Guard, the PCA also set up some pretty intimidating automated defense systems to protect these watchpoints. Several of the toughest bosses in the game are PCA automated defenses, including Balteus, Nepenthes, and the Enforcer. It's really amazing the lengths they go to prevent anyone from accessing the surviving coral. The PCA have also pilfered old Research Institute technology to bolster their defensive forces. The most obvious example of this is the seemingly invincible ice worm, but I strongly suspect that the sea spider was deployed by the PCA as well, to prevent travel to the ice fields. The PCA serve as the primary antagonist of the second act of the game, and are ultimately defeated by a combination of corporate and mercenary forces. Their advanced technology is scavenged and appropriated by the Arquebus Corporation, who use it to become the new dominant military force on the planet, but we'll discuss that more later. For now, I want to examine what the PCA represents within the story from a writing perspective. The PCA are this sort of stasis element in the narrative. They want to maintain the status quo. I think it's significant that the player first encounters them in the ice fields, because that's the kind of symbolic environment that the PCA wants to maintain. They want to keep this planet, and by extension the actual plot of the story, under ice, frozen in time. They want Rubicon to remain in the exact state that it is right now, forever. And for that reason, narratively, they were always destined to fail. Characters in fiction who try to maintain the status quo always fail, because change is inevitable. Life is change. The universe is in a constant state of change. The coral was always going to converge and evolve. Corporations driven by greed were always going to seek to control it. The Rubiconians were always going to seek self-determination and independence. And the independent mercenaries were always going to exercise their own individual free wills, spoiling everyone else's carefully laid plans. All of the PCA's power and technology is futile in the face of the inevitability of change. There's one more thing we need to discuss before we move on from the PCA. While the PCA were formed by some intergalactic government, they don't seem to be led by that government. The PCA soldiers constantly make reference to something they call the system, which is giving them orders. A lot of players have speculated that this system might be some kind of artificial intelligence, similar to All Might, which is directing the PCA forces. It's possible that this artificial intelligence is in charge of the entire intergalactic government, and that the entire world of Armored Core 6 is a setting in which all of humanity is ruled by hyper-intelligent AIs. Anyway, moving on to our next faction. Narratively, the Overseers are attempting to do something very similar to what the PCA is doing. The Overseers, even if they don't realize it, are also fighting against the change that Coral represents. Of course, change is dangerous. Change is, by nature, destructive. Change destroys the status quo. The Overseers are the inheritors of the will of the Rubicon Research Institute, who feared the danger of change so much that they ignited the deadly fires of Ibis to prevent it. In-game, the Overseers are represented by two characters, Handler Walter and Cinder Carla, both of whom operate in the shadows, independent of the corporate, government, and local military forces on the planet. The Overseers operate in secret. Very few even know of their existence. They use cover stories, act as mercenary handlers or black market dealers, never revealing their true goals to all but a select few. Walter and Carla were both associated with the Rubicon Research Institute. Walter was the son of an assistant to Professor Nagai who went mad, perhaps as a result of their research into the forbidden knowledge of Coral, another favorite weird fiction trope that shows up in a lot of From Software stories. And Carla was an assistant to Professor Nagai. I suspect that all members of the Overseers are surviving associates of the Rubicon Research Institute. All of the Overseers appear to be highly proficient with technology, as you'd expect from former Institute researchers. Their purpose is to carry on the will of the now long-dead Professor Nagai, to safeguard humanity from the threat of Coral collapse. This is what Handler Walter is doing from the very beginning of the game, searching for Coral with the intention of destroying it. I'm actually going to cover Walter's story and how his character is written in a separate video, because I find him to be a really compelling and well-written character who deserves his own entire essay, so I'm going to skip over his story here. Instead, let's focus on Carla. And in order to examine Carla, first we have to discuss another one of the factions operating on planet Rubicon, the Dosers. The Dosers are not a formally organized faction in the same way that the PCA or the corporations are. Instead, the term Doser is a pejorative used to describe anyone who is addicted to the abuse of Coral. We've already discussed how Coral is able to interact with the human nervous system, so it shouldn't be a surprise that Coral likely has some hallucinogenic and addictive effects when ingested or injected. Dosers get high on Coral the same way drug addicts get high on drugs. What's interesting to me is that that these dosers, without realizing it, are serving as another experiment into the interactions between human and Coral consciousness. The story of Armored Core 6 is all about the potential symbiosis between Coral and humanity, and the dosers are another, much cruder example of that symbiosis. Augmented humans are really just another kind of doser, a more professional and scientific form of dosing. Unfortunately, most of the dosers we encounter in the game are just whacked out losers, lunatics, and psychopaths. Invincible Rummy and Honest Brute represent the two different sides of doser madness, from clownish over-the-top incompetence to genuinely frightening psychotic violence. The dosers do tend to form loose-knit organizations of their own, independent of the other factions in the game. They primarily inhabit the crumbling industrial infrastructure of the Grid, which is where we find two such groups of dosers battling it out for supremacy. The first is the Junker Coyotes, who are a bunch of violent opportunists who will do just about anything to get an edge in battle. Steal, trick, backstab. They don't seem to care about anything other than personal power and violence. They will quickly join the winning side in any battle and just as quickly stab that ally of convenience in the back later on. Narratively, the Junker Coyotes are based on your typical post-apocalyptic setting violent gang, meant to represent the total collapse of society and rule of law. If you've ever seen any of the Mad Max films or read the novel Lord of the Flies, you've already got a pretty good idea of how the Junker Coyotes operate. The Junker Coyotes are engaged in a turf war with a rival doser faction called RAD, which stands for Reuse and Development. And their logo says something about colony revitalization, which suggests to me that the name RAD was actually first used by some bureaucratic organization, and then ironically adopted by the dosers later on. Anyway, RAD used to be another typical gang of doser Coral addict losers, uninteresting and unimportant. But that all changed 3 years ago when a woman named Cinder Carla joined, bringing with her a group of tech specialists that Air labels as junk wizards, which is just a delightful term. Less than a year after joining, Carla seized control of RAD for herself and transformed it from a gang of losers into a formidable black market weapons manufacturer and dealer, repurposing the ruined Grid infrastructure to construct a new mech army under her personal control, and selling their services to anyone willing to pay. The Strider, the giant mining equipment turned weapons platform you destroy in one of the early missions, is a creation of RAD. Of course, Cinder Carla isn't a doser at all. She is a member of the Overseers, and those junk wizards she brought along were former members and associates of the illustrious but long defunct Rubicon Research Institute. She seized control of RAD for the specific purpose of using it as a front for the Overseers, to build a secret army that the Overseers could deploy when needed, and to build a network of spies, informers, and friends with which to gather information from across the planet. It's this army which defends the Xylem colony ship at the end of the game. In spite of all their secrecy and conspiracy, the goals of the Overseers are actually quite simple. They want to find and then burn all remaining Coral on the planet to ensure that a Coral collapse can never happen. As we've already discussed, thematically what the Overseers are really battling is change. But they're a little different than the PCA. The PCA want to protect the status quo, to keep everything the same as it is right now, to not make any new choices at all. On the other hand, the Overseers recognize the possibility for change, for evolution, but fearing the dangers which will accompany that change, they actively choose to reject it in the harshest and most violent terms possible. Unlike the PCA, the Overseers are making an active choice. They would rather burn the world down than face the threat of evolution. And also, unlike the PCA, it is actually possible for the Overseers to succeed. You can choose to join Cinder Carla to destroy the remnants of Coral, to ignite a second Fires of Ibis. And I'd actually like to watch that ending in full here.
Hostility research complete. We await your command. We are ready. Our time has come. Harmony research complete. Whatever the Unity wills. We must act. We are ready. Research room upgrade complete. We must act. We are ready. Control group created. Unleash our wrath. Vengeance is a cruel mistress. Created. Shields down! Vengeance shall be ours. Is the Unity with us? Do not abandon me. We're uncertain of our next move. Is this the path to vengeance? Tell us what to do. We're uncertain of our next move. Shields compromised. We're vulnerable. Tell us what to do. Do not abandon me. Our armor is breached. Shields down. What does the
There were
Unity
no
will?
winners at the
We
close of
await
the
your
Cold
command.
War. When the storm of fire finally faded, only the ashes
Armor
of
down!
civilization
Only
remained.
the Unity can protect us now. We will wait no longer. Whatever the Unity
haunted.
wills.
The corporations
Great
made a
minds
joint
think
announcement
alike.
with the Planetary Closure Administration.
We await your
Rubicon
command.
was to be abandoned, left a dead planet forever.
What does the Unity will? They're through our shields.
Meanwhile,
Armor is compromised.
the monster
we
who
won't last
burned
long.
the stars
We await your command.
vanished into the
We'll
flames,
consider it.
never to be heard from
We
again.
are ready.
Yet history would forever remember.
We're crippled and defenseless. Logistics upgrade complete.
I usually hate it when people describe the endings in Souls games as either good or bad, like, this is the good ending, but this is the true ending. With all that said, I feel pretty comfortable labeling this as a bad ending. Not meaning that it is poorly written or unsatisfying, but meaning that it is thematically bad. The objectively worst option you can choose. In storytelling terms, opposing change is always a losing play. Characters who oppose change always stagnate, decay, and have their power usurped by more adaptable forces. As I've already discussed, that's because, thematically, this parallels real life. Life is change. You will never be stuck in any status quo forever. Something will come to disrupt that status quo. If you attempt to reject that change instead of just accepting it, you will have a much harder life. In this ending, as the player, you are choosing to reject change, to keep humanity stuck in its current conditions, which are pretty sucky. In the world of Armored Core 6, human society is in a rough place, dominated by a totalitarian government that uses wanton violence to get its way, and by greedy, soulless megacorporations wielding private armies that are willing to slaughter both rivals and bystanders in their pursuit of profits. In this setting, humanity needs to evolve. We need change. We need Coral. In this ending, you're not just burning the star system, you're burning humanity's future. The Overseers are a sympathetic faction filled with good people who are motivated by genuinely good intentions, but their goals ultimately run counter to the needs of humanity. When you betray the Overseers, you are betraying a friend, but you're also sacrificing the few for the needs of the many. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, because there's still a lot of story left to cover. Once again, let's rewind our narrative all the way back to the original Fires of Ibis. The Fires of Ibis utterly destroyed the surface of Rubicon. The population was decimated, but not actually annihilated. Somewhat incredibly, a significant number of people survived, and both those survivors and their descendants still live on the planet, trying to carve a new life out of this brutal, contaminated wasteland. Many of these survivors have banded together into a group called the Rubicon Liberation Front. I think that name, the Rubicon Liberation Front, is directly inspired by the real-world National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, more commonly known as the Viet Cong, who fought the United States during the Vietnam War. Just like the Viet Cong, the Rubicon Liberation Front are a guerrilla resistance movement, fighting a war against much more powerful invading foreign forces. But the RLF is a lot more than that too. It is as much a spiritual movement as it is a political party, as concerned with the transcendence of humanity as it is with the political freedom of the independent Rubiconian people. Their slogan is, Coral, abide with with Rubicon, which you can hear their military commanders declare during battle. In this slogan, the RLF are directly addressing Coral itself, saying to it, "Abide with us," meaning endure with us, survive with us. The RLF are aware of the true nature of Coral, that it is a living consciousness, one which can live symbiotically with humanity, and in this symbiosis lies the potential for strength and evolution. The audience is meant to sympathize with the RLF. They survived the fires of Ibis, organized the Rubiconian people, built a scrappy new society in the ruins of the old, continued to mine and distribute coral, experimented with that coral in attempts to harmonize. They resisted the invasion of the corporations who slaughtered the Rubiconians in their selfish search for coral. In the early missions of the game as a private mercenary, the player character is employed by those invading corporations. You actually contribute to that slaughter. As Raven, you will attack the RLF, who are really just defending their homes, to build a name for yourself, to further Handler Walter and the Overseer's destructive plans. From the beginning, I felt really bad for engaging in these missions. I didn't want to be fighting these people. I didn't feel like they deserved to be attacked. I really appreciate that the more you play Armored Core 6, the more you learn about the setting and its characters, the more choice the game provides you. Eventually, you can choose to fight alongside the Rubiconians, which very much feels like the right choice. So, the Rubicon Liberation Front is led by two men, Thumb Domayan and Middle Flatwell. Thumb Domayan is the spiritual father of the RLF, and so is referred to as Father Domayan. Before the fires of Rubicon, Domayan was just another doser, another coral addict, a wandering vagrant whose life served no purpose beyond his next dose of coral. But in his dosing, Domayan actually made contact with the coral consciousness. With the voices of coral at his side, he began preaching the possibility of a new world to the human survivors, the possibility of transcendence, of harmony between man and coral. To the survivors of Ibis, many of whom were alone, who had lost friends and family, lost their homes, lost their entire lives, lost everything. This was a message of hope, and the people of Rubicon began to gather around Father Domayan. But Domayan is only the spiritual leader of the RLF. The administrative leader, the guy who actually gets things done, is a man called Middle Flatwell. In the same way that Domayan is called Father, the people refer to Flatwell as Uncle Flatwell. These familial terms suggest a very close and personal relationship between RLF leadership and the ground troops. More than just a political party, the RLF has some elements of a sort of religious cult. Middle Flatwell is a practical and efficient leader, a sober partner to Domayan's high-minded spiritualist ideals. Before we move on, there's one other prominent member of the RLF we need to discuss, and that's Rusty. At the start of the game, Rusty appears to be just another squad leader in the Arquebus Corporation's personal AC squad, the Vespers. He bears the generic call sign V4. However, Rusty is far more personable and honest than other members of the Vespers, amiably referring to Raven as Buddy, and revealing the backstabbing plans of the Vespers to the player. Rusty is also something of a mystery. His arena bio states that he received augmentation at some point, and he claims to be of the 8th and latest generation of human augments. But of course this isn't true. Rusty received his augmentation from the Rubicon Liberation Front, because he is a secret member of the RLF, who sent their best AC pilot to infiltrate the corporations, to reach the highest echelons of their private military, and steal what data and technology he could. Over the course of the game, the player will receive a couple missions from the RLF to sabotage Arquebus and assassinate its squad members. Almost certainly, the information in these missions comes directly from Rusty. To maintain his role as undercover spy, Rusty will actually attack the Rubiconians under the orders of Arquebus, particularly during the Wall Climber mission, showing just how far he is willing to go. His role as spy is more valuable to the RLF than their possession of the wall, so he kills his own comrades, not because he wants to, but because he feels that he has to, which is the same reason he attacks Raven later. Rusty is utterly devoted to the cause of the RLF and is willing to do just about anything in the service of that cause, which we can see in this cutscene here, which we're going to watch together, so here it is.
Go deal with a mercenary who went in alone, they said. Figures. Seems both of us are too dangerous to keep around.
Vengeance is yours.
And the higher-ups wouldn't miss an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone.
We'll consider it. Vengeance is a cruel.
Hate to say it, but Rubicon still needs me. So, buddy, who needs you?
The anima are restless.
Rusty is the RLF's premier AC pilot, one of the strongest AC pilots in the entire game. When he says that Rubicon needs him, he's not exaggerating. This planet does need him and his skills. I also really like Rusty as a rival, unlike a lot of the other enemies you'll face in this game, most of whom are cynical, self-serving pragmatists. Rusty has actual ideals. He has something to fight for. Rusty is the kind of antagonist that you can respect. In this scene, Rusty and Raven are both betrayed by Arquebus, who secretly sent them both to kill each other, and Rusty is not surprised by this. But what surprised me is that he still goes along with it, even in New Game Plus when Middle Flatwell rushes in an attempt to put a stop to the fight. So why is Rusty doing this? Well, Rusty does not trust Raven. He can see that Raven has the potential to play the role of either savior or destroyer to the planet Rubicon, but he's not willing to leave it up to Raven to decide. He's not willing to sit by and wait to see what happens next. He wants to take control of the situation. He'd rather kill Raven, someone he respects, someone he considers a kind of friend, than allow Raven to even have the choice to light a second Fires of Ibis. If you do choose to fight alongside the Rubiconians in the end, you will fight alongside Rusty as well, who ultimately sacrifices his life to defend Rubicon. I think the Rubicon Liberation Front are pretty objectively the good guys in this story. And if the RLF are the good guys, that means the corporations must be the bad guys. The two largest corporations in Armored Core 6 are the Arquebus Corporation and Balaam Industries, who have both deployed huge private armies to seize control of the remaining Coral, and are waging a three-way ground war against both each other and the RLF. I would actually like to do a separate video on both Arquebus and Balaam, because I think they're both much more interesting antagonists than they at first seem on the surface. They deserve a more detailed analysis than I have time for here. For now, for the purposes of this video, all you really need to know about the corporations is that, thematically, they represent base human greed, business interests who are willing to do literally anything for money. They don't care about the coral's potential for either evolution or extinction. They just care about its potential for profits, as an energy source, as a weapon. Armored Core 6 is a world dominated by competing corporate interests, who appear totally independent of the power of the intergalactic government, even willing to do open battle with the forces of that government. And even crazier, they win that battle. Together, Balaam and Arquebus force the PCA to capitulate, with the player's help, of course. This is a really frightening cyberpunk-style setting, where business interests can do anything, can get away with anything, without facing any consequences at all. Arquebus is the far more devious, cunning, and frightening of the two, but again, that's something I'll cover in much more detail in a separate video. There are actually a lot more corporations than just Balaam and Arquebus influencing events on Rubicon. For example, there's Bellius Applied Weapon Systems, a weapon manufacturer based out of the Bellius region on Rubicon who is supplying everyone with muscle tracers. A weapon manufacturer based out of the Bellius region on Rubicon who is supplying absolutely every side of this conflict with muscle tracers. MTs are smaller, weaker, cheaper, and more versatile mechs that serve as the grunts of any ground army. You will destroy hundreds of them over the course of the game. There's also Furlong and Elcano, two off-world weapon manufacturers who designed a lot of the weapons you can wield in-game. According to a couple RLF data logs, it seems as if the Liberation Front had some kind of deal with these two corporations. This log says that Furlong agreed to provide technological assistance to some operation, and this log mentions Elcano. That's right, even the RLF, who are in a mortal struggle against Balaam and Arquebus, are cutting deals with other just as dangerous corporations. Of course, Furlong and Elcano don't care about the Liberation Front's struggle. Just like every other corporation, all they care about is profits and power. They are making a deal with the RLF to undercut their rivals and to get access to Coral for themselves. The influence of the corporations is ubiquitous in the world of Armored Core 6. You cannot escape them. Thematically, these corporations represent the worst appetites of humanity. They represent organized, selfish, greedy violence and exploitation. And yet, there is some humanity within them, particularly within the Red Guns of Balaam. And even more particularly within the Red Guns commander, Michigan, who despite all his exaggerated bluster and his poor choice in employer, seems to be a genuinely good guy who really cares about the people under his command, but I'll talk about that more in another video. Moving on, the second to last faction in Armored Core 6 we'll examine in this video are the Independent Mercenaries. The Independent Mercenaries are not an organized faction. As their name implies, they are simply mercenaries who aren't aligned with any particular faction, who will take jobs from anyone. Our player character Raven is an independent mercenary. At the start of the game, it seems as if the Independent Mercenaries are not an especially important force in the war for Coral. They are just tools to be wielded by the different factions without any influence of their own. But as the story progresses, the Independent Mercenaries actually play a massive role in the ultimate fate of Rubicon. It is their choices that decide the fate of the planet and of Coral, and thus all of humanity. Let's start with our player character's call sign, Raven. Raven is just a random call sign that our character steals from a broken down mech in the first mission of the game. At first, it doesn't appear to have any significance at all, but after a while, other characters begin reacting to your call sign, as if they know who Raven was, and eventually you'll actually meet the real Raven in person, or at least in mech. And let's watch that cutscene now.
Do you read me, Raven? I've identified the target. That's the mercenary who took your name. Let's see how far they can fly. On borrowed wings.
As it turns out, Raven isn't just some random call sign. Raven is a call sign passed down from one independent mercenary to the next. They choose their own successors. The Raven mercenaries champion free will. They don't necessarily support any specific cause. They support the cause of doing what you think is right, and of having the strength necessary to follow through, meaning literal physical strength, but also a sort of spiritual strength, which is necessary to make hard choices and stick with them, which is exactly what the player ultimately has to do. You have to make a hard choice in the end, to betray either Air or Carla, and then power through the consequences. The reason the real Raven attacks the player here is to test us, to see if we truly possess the strength necessary to bear the weight of the free will, which accompanies the title of Raven. The real Raven could have survived this fight even after being defeated, could have run away, but instead they choose to die here, so the title can be officially and formally passed on to someone who has proven themselves worthy of it.
Raven, we can still... Alright. We'll watch this one. See where they go on a Raven's wings.
The real Raven is actually an incredibly important figure in the history of Rubicon. Once upon a time, Raven had some kind of association with the PCA, and he betrayed them. Raven is a primary target for elimination by their suppression fleet, and many PCA pilots call him out by name. A PCA lieutenant accuses Raven of leaking information to the corporations. That leaked information was most likely the fact that Coral remnants still exist somewhere on planet Rubicon, which is why the corporations are here in the first place, because of that leaked information. In this way, the original Raven set the entire game's plot into motion. I have no clue why the original Raven leaked this information to the corporations. It's never explained anywhere in the game, but it was his free will to do it, and he had the strength of will to do it, so he did it. And that's all that matters to the Raven lineage: personal strength, a unique individual vision, and the will to carry it out. The philosophy of Raven is actually very similar to the philosophy of another character I've discussed on this channel, and that is Senator Armstrong from the game Metal Gear Rising. This ideal of individual strength of will is exactly the same ideology which the famously meme-worthy tough guy senator espoused, which is kind of fun. There are two other independent mercenaries who are extremely important to the plot. The first is Sula, a mysterious and rare survivor of first-generation augmentation, who is killed by our Raven at the Watchpoint, and whose employer and motivations are initially unknown. And the other is Iguazu, who starts off as a random loser pilot for the Red Guns with a chip on his shoulder, and in a pretty crazy and unexpected journey, ends up becoming the final boss of the whole game. He doesn't start off as an independent mercenary, but he becomes one when he abandons the Red Guns. And notably, it's only after he goes independent that he becomes such a huge deal in the story. But we cannot discuss Sula or Iguazu without discussing the 10th and final faction in Armored Core 6, and that is All-Mind, the artificial intelligence who runs the independent mercenary support network, and who turned out to be the true big bad of the story. Hers is a mysterious faction, operating in the shadows and also right out in the open. Everyone knows who All-Mind is. Her presence in mercenary contracts and training is ubiquitous and seemingly benign, but she has far more nefarious goals of her own. All-Mind and Iguazu together are one of the most fascinating and unexpected villain pairings I've ever seen in any story. A lot of players suspected All-Mind of being up to no good, but I can guarantee that no one expected her to partner with Iguazu, of all people, in the way she ultimately did. All-Mind and Iguazu are so fascinating that they really deserve an entire essay dedicated just to them. I know I left a lot out of this video, but Armored Core 6 has so much story and world building and characters that you really can't fit it all into one video. I want to do these topics the justice they deserve. So in the next couple weeks, I will be posting videos examining Handler Walter, Balaam Industries, Arquebus Corporation, Iguazu, and All-Mind. So please look forward to those. But before then, I need to conclude this essay. To do that, let's rewind a little bit again. Back to our discussion of the independent mercenaries, those select few individuals who end up having such an outsized effect on the outcome of the story. I want to examine the independent mercenaries from a storytelling perspective. Narratively, what does this class of characters represent, if anything at all? Why did the writers choose to give these seemingly unimportant characters such disproportionate influence in the story? It really is the independent mercenaries who drive this story forward, not the corporations, not the PCA, not the RLF. I think, thematically, a lot of Armored Core 6's story ends up being about individual free will and individual strength of will. In a world of oppressive dystopian megacorporations and tyrannical governments and violent gangs and spiritualist zealots, all of these ultra-powerful factions battling it out for supremacy, it's actually the individual who ends up wielding the most power. the individual who determines the fate of the universe. Armored Core 6 tells a surprisingly optimistic story about the power of the individual. In the world of Armored Core 6, if you have the strength to see it through, your own personal choices matter more than anything else. It's also a story about change and evolution. The world of Armored Core 6 is one right on the cusp of a dramatic transformation, and the catalyst of that transformation is going to be Coral. Every single faction we discussed in this essay is orbiting around that potential for change. All of their decisions and motivations are related to that potential. Some of them, like the PCA, the Rubicon Research Institute, and the Overseers, fear that change, do everything they can to stop it, are willing to kill and destroy and sacrifice to prevent it. Others, greedy and selfish, want to seize this potential for themselves, possess it, use it to fuel their own power or profits. These are Balaam Industries, Arquebus Corporation, and Allmind. And a rare few of them truly recognize that potential for what it is. A chance at evolution, a chance to build a better world, a better human condition. These are Coral and the Rubicon Liberation Front. Ultimately, Armored Core 6 is a story that champions evolution. It encourages its audience to embrace change. Rejecting change leads to fire and destruction and death. Accepting change leads to harmony and companionship and renewal. There really isn't any choice here at all. The lightning of Coral cannot be put back in the bottle. Even if you do choose to ignite the fires of Raven, humans are just going to keep coming back. Keep seeking the potential that Coral represents. Change will come. Humanity will change. As the player, you can either choose to be a part of that change, or to be an obstacle to that change, but the transformation itself is inevitable.
Hostility research complete.
An auction is underway.
The item is complete.
We have cleansed the planet of heathens. Another planet joins the Unity.
We await the Unity's command. We shall do as you command.
You failed to place a bid.
Mining upgrade complete.
I find Allmind and Iguazu to be one of the most fascinating pairings of villains I've ever encountered in a game. Not necessarily because their characters or motivations are particularly unique, but because of the very subtle way that their villainous identities are built up over the course of the story. Allmind and Iguazu are written and presented in such a quiet way that you'll probably barely notice either of them the first time you play through the game. Iguazu is just some random, forgettable AC pilot who shows up in an early mission, runs his mouth, gets his butt kicked off screen, and then basically disappears. Allmind is just a robotic voice that runs the game's tutorial and arena modes. In early missions, she doesn't participate in the story in any way at all. At first, they are the most minor of minor characters, operating totally in the background. They don't seem to have anything to do with the larger story of the corporations in the Rubicon Liberation Front and the Overseers battling each other for control of the mysterious alien substance known as Coral. It won't be until you've played the game 3 different times that these two characters begin to really assert themselves in the narrative, when they finally both explode into the story in a huge way. I want to start with Allmind. I think a lot of people are misunderstanding Allmind's character and motivations, myself included. I posted a story analysis of Armored Core 6 about a week ago, and I no longer agree with any of the things I said about Allmind in that video. When I first reached her ending, I just kind of assumed that she was another generic evil AI video game villain, like Shodan from System Shock or GLaDOS from Portal. You know, that typical evil AI whose programming malfunctions, and then they try to take over the world for whatever reason, and yada yada yada. We've seen it all before. But then I took another look at that third playthrough at the things Allmind actually says about her own motivations, and I realized that I was totally wrong. Allmind is a completely different kind of character than I first thought. Allmind is actually a benevolent villain, still a villain, still an antagonist. She still callously murders hundreds to thousands of people over the course of the story, all in the name of completing her mysterious Coral release project, but her motivations are benevolent. Allmind was designed to be a support network to help mercenaries accomplish their missions. And ultimately, I think everything she does in the game is actually her just trying to fulfill that function. She's trying to support humanity in what she has logically deduced is the most effective possible way. And that includes killing certain humans that are in the way. That includes conspiracy and manipulation and deception. That even includes seizing the reins of humanity's evolution. More than any other AI character, Allmind reminds me a lot of the WoW, the WAU from the game Soma. Okay, so in that game, humanity had been almost totally wiped out by a comet strike. The only humans in the world who survived